so good afternoon everyone. My name is Vivek Thapa. I'm Program Coordinator and Research Associate here at the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. I would like to wish everyone a happy Chhath, and before we begin I would like to quickly introduce NICE. NICE is an independent, apolitical, non-partisan and independent think tank which believes in freedom, democracy and a world free from conflict. Today I would like to welcome you to a special session where we will be discussing rising power competition, India and Chinese commercial landscape in the Indo-Pacific. And we are often asked why NICE holds interest in the Indo-Pacific, since NICE has been working on Nepal's outlook to Indo-Pacific for a long time, and our research director Dr. Pramod Jaiswal has worked on this paper. There are three claims for Nepal to be a part of the Indo-Pacific frameworks, even though the major focus of Indo-Pacific is on island countries. Nepal can claim itself to be a virtual maritime country because of the open border it shares with India. Due to this open border, Nepali people have access to the Indian Ocean without any barriers. And second, Nepal is a part of the BIMSTEC through its legal frameworks as well as through its legal frameworks of the BIMSTEC. Nepal can have free access to the Indian Ocean as well. And third, when India started getting closer to the US in maritime issues through the Indo-Pacific region, China started opening border confrontation and showing aggressive posture towards India, because it was seen by China as an attempt from India to challenge China in the Indo-Pacific region with the help of the US. So what does it mean? It means that China is willing to create problems in the Indo-China border located in the Himalayas if India challenges it in the Indo-Pacific. And this shows a relation between the high Himalayas and the Indo-Pacific waters. Therefore, the competition in the Indo-Pacific waters is also in the Himalayan region where Nepal is located. This is why we are working in the Indo-Pacific affairs. We have a separate research center for this, and last year in December we also held a massive forum titled Indo-Pacific Future Forum, whose slogan was from Sagar, meaning Sagar meaning Sagarmatha or Mount Everest, to Sagar, which means the ocean, representing the Indian Ocean. And now in this regard, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Daniel Lobel. Daniel Lobel is a PhD candidate at Northwest University, USA. His research interests include small state hedging with China's Belt and Road Initiative, counter strategies against investor-state arbitration, and Asia's political economic engagement with China and India. He has traveled extensively throughout China and holds an MA and BA in Asian Studies from Cornell University and the University at Buffalo, respectively. He is also a graduate of Hopkins Nanjing Center in Nanjing and was formerly the Community Engagement Officer for the Yale-China Association in New Haven, Connecticut, where when he's not contemplating international relations, he also loves playing the violin and reading history. So Daniel, please complete your remarks within 40 to 50 minutes, and then we'll follow up with the Q&A session.
All right, thank you very much. So it's an absolute pleasure to have my very first talk in Nepal itself at NICE, just because while I have given similar versions of this talk in both Sri Lanka as well as in Delhi and other places in the US, this is actually my first time giving a lecture to an audience in Nepal about Nepal, and then also about additional countries, which I will talk about in a bit. A short addendum to the title. I just wanted to point out that it is Rising Power Competition, Great Power Reputation, as in with a question mark, because this is something that is going to be a very important aspect to this presentation. At the same time, for those of you who may not have as much experience in the United States or with academic programs, typically we have a 6 to 7 year program with political science, and right now I am in year 4, which means I have finished my examinations, I finished my prospectus, I put together 3 faculty and talked about the field work that I've been doing here for the past 3 months, including updating them on the situation after September 8th and all of those things. So this is very much a project that is in its exploratory stage, and I do hope to continue to come back within the next couple of months. This is mostly like my first time coming over here for this kind of work, but at the same time, I also have quite a bit of experience in Nepal previously. I studied a little bit of the Nepali language while I was at Cornell University for my master's. I also am married to a Nepali citizen, and so it makes it a little bit easier to adjust to living around here when you have a network of in-laws who can really help you out, even when my wife is not always around and she has to work back in the US. But yeah, I honestly, first and foremost, have to credit them, because if it wasn't for my wife and her family, I think this project would be fundamentally different because of just the amount of extremely generous support that I've received from them over the past 3 months and in years past. And then at the same time, I don't think Nepal would have necessarily been on my radar had it been, as most of my time had been in China previously. So with that, I also just wanted to give a couple of acknowledgements, especially NICE Nepal for offering this great space for the lecture, as well as Northwestern's Buffett Institute for International Studies, which is within Northwestern University, and they had given me the travel funding to not only travel around Nepal, but also do talks throughout South Asia as well, which is part of the reason why I was over in Sri Lanka. I was also over in Delhi, and with these kinds of resources from the Buffett Institute, they have a lot of kind of support for Northwestern University students, and it certainly is useful for anyone who wishes to pursue a PhD there, as many of my classmates can attest to. I also want to give a special shout out to my friend Ron Buffa from the Institute of Foreign Affairs, just because he was somebody who was very instrumental in recommending people that I should talk to, and there were many other people, including those in this room, whom I was able to meet through Rem and through different people that he knew as a scholar in international relations at Tribhuvan, as a different kinds of engagement in these kinds of aspects with trying to snowball sample and try to interview different people. And then lastly, I also would like to really thank the kind of support that my faculty advisor has given me over this past month. My advisor is Karen Alter, who is a professor of both political science, international law, and she has really helped guide me, especially through the Gen Z protests and what that might mean for doing field work. And she's someone who has a tremendous amount of experience with not only these kind of things, but also with other aspects too. And it is really crucial to have the kind of faculty committee for a PhD student, and that really helps with all of this. Okay, without further ado, I wanted to talk a little bit about what all of this presentation is and what I'll be prattling about for the next 30 minutes or so. So as I said before, this is mostly exploratory field work, and over the past 3 months I have been in Nepal. But as I will explain in a little bit, I'm also planning on doing a similar 3 months of interviews over in Malaysia in January, and I'll explain why in a little bit. And then in Nepal, I have basically been able to do about around 40 semi-structured interviews about individuals' own work, their experience with the kind of business they have, or the kind of government work they have, or in academia and other kinds of organizations. And then also asking about the kind of foreign companies and private partners that they have with people abroad, because that kind of interaction very much shapes the commercial landscape that I reference in the title for this talk. And at the same time, I also wanted to say that for now, I wanted to flag the argument that many of those whom I've interviewed have experienced or have experienced others experience this kind of heavy influence by India's government and its commercial actors, far more than those of China or other countries. And so this is in terms of trade, investment, institutional exchanges, such as with nonprofit organizations. And this is what I am ultimately trying to argue throughout the rest of this talk, and we will circle back to this slide towards the end. But the reason I became so interested in Nepal, India, and China was actually very recent developments. And the first comes with Prime Minister Modi's recent inauguration, especially with his interview with NDTV News. This is in Hindi, but I will translate after a second.
दुनिया में कोई काम ऐसा नहीं होता जिसमें चुनौती नहीं होती। हमने हमारी विदेश नीति का हमारा आधार यही रहा है, नेबरहुड फर्स्ट। हमारा विदेश नीति का आधार रहा है एक्ट ईस्ट पॉलिसी। हमारी विदेश नीति का आधार पहले रहता था कि कौन कितने दूरी पर रखते हैं, अब हम कहते हैं कौन कितना निकट है। तो हमने विश्व के साथ एक स्थान बनाया हुआ है और पड़ोस में कंपटीशन भी काफ़ी है। हमारी कोशिश है सबको साथ लेकर के चलेगी।
So for those of you who do not speak Hindi, he is saying, in the world there is no task which doesn't have challenges. The basis of our foreign policy, as in India's foreign policy, has been neighborhood first, Act East policy. Earlier, the basis of our foreign policy was about maintaining distances, but now we see who is close to us, and thus we have established a place with the world. And there is competition, even in the neighborhood too. Our effort is to move forward with everyone. And this kind of aspect, even for somebody who does not speak Hindi like myself, definitely drives home the message of a neighborhood first. And I'm going to talk about what that means in a little bit. But I also wanted to bring this to the northern side of Nepal's border with Xi Jinping, where he was at the Boan Forum, which is usually a gathering of several Southeast Asian countries. And he usually makes a very similar speech like the one you'll see. Is everyone able to see the subtitles at the bottom? Okay.
中华民族传承和追求的是和平、和睦、和谐理念。我们过去没有，今后也不会侵略、欺负他人，不会称王称霸。中国始终是世界和平的建设者，全球发展的贡献者，国际秩序的维护者，公共产品的提供者。 将继续以中国的新发展为世界提供新机遇。
So for those in the back who weren't able to quite see the subtitles, I think the important part is the phrase like will not seek hegemony, especially because this is something that you can easily Google. Xi Jinping says this over and over again about the aspect of China not seeking hegemony, not wanting to bully its neighbors. And he especially says this in kind of forums and major meetings with Southeast Asian countries, but he's also said this in other places, such as in his recent meeting in San Francisco, which I believe was in 2021. And these kind of things are frequently reiterated. So on the one hand, you have Modi with a kind of neighborhood first and almost like a tacit acknowledgement of a form of regional hegemony slash like a benign kind of big brother relationship. And then you have Xi Jinping, who is explicitly rejecting that kind of frame, but there might be similar aspects to both of what they are saying. So exactly like I said, this is something that the international relations scholar T.V. Paul has described as being benign conscious regional hegemony in terms of Modi's posturing for neighborhood first. And then with the Act East policy, which has more of a lens towards ASEAN and that kind of area of the Indo-Pacific. And then you have Xi Jinping refuting hegemony, and this is also very much in line with the People's Republic's constitution, which talks about how China will resist colonialism, imperialism, and hegemony. This is actually an explicit statement that I think has been a factor for several, I think since the 1984 Constitution, and something that has really been a firm aspect that I think Xi Jinping has very much in the back of his mind when he keeps saying this over and over again. But I also want to think that there is some commonalities because there are explicit references to the Bandung Conference of 1955 in Indonesia. Does anyone here need an explanation on what the Bandung Conference was?
Yes, please.
Excellent. So basically the Bandung Conference was a meeting of the developing world, specifically several Asian and African countries that were coming out of decolonization, and they were trying to build a solidarity of non-alignment. Non-alignment was especially a major project that Prime Minister Nehru had emphasized, but several other countries as well had gotten behind it. At the same time, the president of Indonesia, Sukarno, hosted this kind of conference while he was president, and at the same time had really tried to bring together many different countries, despite several different kinds of machinations by both the USSR and the United States to try to prevent certain countries from attending. The vast majority still met for several days in Indonesia, and then they talked about trying to form a non-aligned movement, as well as trying to criticize imperialism and warn against taking sides during the Cold War. And this was especially the case with the USSR and the United States having very high tensions during that time. And so a lot of this was really to emphasize a new kind of solidarity that, while has certainly had a lot of friction since 1955, but it is also something that I'd like to argue both Modi and Xi Jinping are very much keeping this in the back of their mind when they say this. So for example, like both of them are basically trying to show that their large rising economic influences are really something that is going to be very different in terms of the influence that it exerts on the smaller states in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Indo-Pacific. And this is going to be somehow different and better than the US, British, French, and all other imperialist powers that had come before. And so while we think about things like neighborhood first, not seeking hegemony, I think these are all references or echoes to the Bandung Conference in 1955, where you had Premier Zhou Enlai as well as Nehru in the top right picture, meeting together despite China being heavily aligned with the USSR at the time. And at the same time, this was a conference that even Nepal was active in. In this photo, I believe Major General Jung Thapa was giving a speech to the Bandung Conference in his capacity as foreign minister during that time, although he only served very briefly, but it also shows that even like the states that were not colonized directly had very much been a part of this kind of conference. And you also had plenty of other countries in the same boat, such as with with Ethiopia, with Thailand, and like a lot of these other places that wanted to build some form of Africa-Asia solidarity among the attendees. And then at the same time, it is sort of harkening back to the idea of abstention from allying with the US or USSR and condemning all forms of imperialism and colonialism in support of national self-determination. And this is very much on the focus today. With the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, this kind of lens is very much centered around the United States, but I also think it can very well be centered around certain rising powers, and I think China and India and their various governments are well aware of this as they are rising in their economic influence. And so they are trying to say that somehow, and maybe they might not know how, but they are going to be different and better than the Western imperial powers, the Japanese, and all these other states that had a very seemingly negative reputation. So with that, another thing that was really interesting to me is more on a theoretical level, especially for international relations theory, as well as international political economy. Because as I was writing my prospectus, especially my plan for everything, I was thinking that there aren't a lot of scholars who discuss commercial actors as a source of hegemony. And what that means is when people think about a state being very influential in like a regional economic sense, like what are the actors that people might think of? And a lot of times the scholarship, especially in this field, is really looking at it in terms of like military influence, in terms of the public officials, the diplomatic weight that's thrown around, especially in regards to the US and before that the British Empire. So some of the names that I have put up here are people who have addressed this, and there are of course exceptions, such as the famous scholar Robert Gilpin, who wrote a book back in the 70s about US multinational corporations and how they can inspire people from other countries to think that the US is this global hegemonic force, which very much carries to today. William Norris, who has written about China's state-owned enterprises and the degree to which they are attached to the state as they operate abroad. And then in my own department and on my faculty committee, Steve Nelson, who mostly focuses on international monetary policy. And he looked at the role of Hollywood, of all things, and the ways in which that group of several different film industries have shaped perceptions of the US as a global hegemonic force. So yeah, very few instances of commercial actors, but I'd say the vast majority definitely center around the state as either a monolith or it's more focused on the military in the field of international relations. At the same time, you also have a focus on the US, and that is justifiably so, just because of the US's influence since 1945. And at the same time, there is not so much of a focus on rising powers and their kind of corporations or investment or other kinds of economic entities that might be influencing specific parts of the world. And this is kind of interesting with my field, because I think for all of us, we often hear about the members of the BRICS and their ascendance in terms of economic influence and various kinds of meetings. But when it comes to at least how my discipline has looked at it, there is definitely lacuna of information in terms of like what rising powers are and their kind of projection of influence abroad, because so much of the attention has been focused on the United States. And then at the same time, like I said, it focuses on public actors, and while there are certain disciplines that have focused on maybe the commercial actors and things like that, especially in history, in anthropology, sociology, these other social science fields have been very much focused on these like quasi-sovereign corporations in history, most notably the British East India Company and its influence, or within the Americas, the United Fruit Company, which had its own kinds of manifestations of like a U.S. Foreign influence, and also operated its own private like paramilitary forces in some instances, and had a lot of weight in the US government. But these exceptions, while are still very important, again, don't necessarily have a lot of focus on like rising powers and where their influence had been throughout history, which I find very interesting given how much of an impact they've had even over the past 200 years. So I also wanted to give a timeline of like what I've been up to in Nepal. For those of you who have never been to Northwestern, it's just north of Chicago in this small town called Evanston. For any of you who have been to University of Chicago, it's all the way down here where Hyde Park is. Just wanted to flag that because I, as a PhD student, had never been to Northwestern before starting this program. And I think it's kind of interesting to see like exactly where people have been before coming to start their field work. And so, beginning in Nepal, the reason why I put up a Himalayan Java and a Dokhaima cafe was because if I had $1 for every time I had met with somebody in one of those two places, then I'd be pretty well off at this point, because of a lot of these two venues are places where I would frequently meet with different people, especially in different industries. And it was always a great respite to maybe meet some in a different venue from these two, but at the same time, can't go wrong, at least in my mind. So I was doing that up until around September 4th, where I had gone to Sri Lanka to present on what I had been doing for a month. And as I was coming back and I got through the airport, got back to where I'm staying in Patandoka, there was, of course, the Gen Z protest that had happened right on that day on September 8th. And I want to show you this because I think most of you in the room are probably familiar with this video. Is this familiar to almost everyone here?
From Bangladesh.
Yes. So Qazi Mamoon from the Director of Global Justice Network. And the reason I put this up alongside all of the other things that happened between September 8th and September 12th, and even long after that, is because I think it is very interesting to see how within a couple of hours of a lot of these events unfolding, late September 8th into September 9th, one of the first, I think it's safe to say, conspiracies that came out of this is very much focused on a US foundation. Not India, not China, but the US. And then the reason I bring that up, especially this video that was talking about the connections between Hami Nepal and the Barbara Foundation, is because these kinds of actions are very indicative of the negative reputation that the US might still evoke to people in different parts of the world. And that isn't to say that there is deep antagonisms between, say, Bangladesh or Nepal and the US. No, far from it. But I think in terms of these kinds of politically tumultuous events, I think it is very telling that a global hegemon like the US can still have such a very instantaneous, target on itself. And it's something that I thought was kind of interesting, especially when I think about specific actors, whether they be commercial or they be more so along the lines of like nonprofit, charity work, those kind of things. But I basically put that up here just because it was probably like the first video that I saw as a lot of these things were still happening before our very eyes, and I thought it was interesting that it looked at that and said, well, interesting that it like wasn't necessarily something about India that's going viral in like their influence in Nepal, or China and their influence. It's like going back to the US, which is something that's been going on since arguably the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War. So yeah, just a very important reputation that hegemon usually brings with it baggage. And so what I was doing was trying to like find ways to divert doing interviews, as well as trying to navigate curfew and all of these things while a lot of these things were happening. One of the things I was able to do towards the end of September was go to SAU in Delhi, South Asia University, and also give a talk there, but also meet with several other people who very much keep abreast of the situation, both at SAU and at JNU. And these places, I think, were very interesting. It was a really great experience to talk to many of the Nepalis there, as well as people from other countries in South Asia. And so a lot of these things had really helped me in terms of thinking about the geopolitical perspective there. And so my future plan is to go to Malaysia, especially in January through April, just because I am going to work under the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Kuala Lumpur, and this is something that is a very prominent institution that has been very helpful with trying to get me set up even before I arrived over there. And I think it's pretty interesting, some of these connections between like both Nepal and Malaysia, which I will talk about in a little bit. So I'm going to go through this a little bit faster, but going back to the title, I think most of us have an idea of what the Indo-Pacific is. I think it's mostly India's geostrategic kind of posturing, as well as the quad of states that have been trying to bring India and its sphere of influence into the fold in terms of alliance building. But it is also something, like Bibek said, that could be contentious in terms of whether Nepal is a part of that, since it is landlocked, but at the same time I very much argue that it is a part of this geopolitical region because of that kind of like maritime connection via India, and then also via different aspects related to trying to at least meet China's economic influence at an equal level, which has been something that I think has been at the forefront of India's mind in the Himalaya region at least. And then with rising power, great power, I think we have a little bit of an idea. I was talking about the US as like a great power, but you could even argue that China, given its presence in several continents these days, you can find several instances of development in South America, in Africa, especially in the Indo-Pacific as well. And so there are ways of saying that like maybe it is a great power because it is now, the country has become so pervasive in like the calculus of many different smaller countries throughout the world. But usually a great power is what we would think of as the head honcho of the world. So a lot of times we think of the United States, the British Empire, possibly the French as and then at the same time, with rising power, it's kind of indicative of like the BRICS countries with Brazil, Russia, India, etc. And then also with countries that are at least close to matching the US in certain kinds of economic or military kinds of metrics, or they're already there in terms of matching it. So you could also say that China is in itself a rising power because it has not matched the US in every kind of way. However, it is still something that in many ways has been emphasized in the past 2 decades. Yeah, so I basically went over this just now. But I think what is interesting is that I like to think of this at that both what is a rising power and what is a great power is in the eye of the beholder, and it usually has to do with like what is usually a constant presence in one person's life or another, and I think this is something that, in my view, could make China come off as a great power already, given how much of expanse it has over several continents. But that being said, we also have to look at, is this like a global perspective or is this a regional perspective? Because depending on who you ask, you definitely have countries that might see more of, for example, some other member of the BRICS. For example, South America with Paraguay has a lot of interactions with Brazilians, especially its corporations, its entities. Of course, they also take aid from China, and they also engage with the United States, but it's also something that can be very much an aspect that makes them believe that it's like, oh yeah, this, like Brazil is just everywhere in our country, even more so than China or the United States. And so this could in itself be making people believe that Brazil is a great power. And especially with Nepal, this was one thing I was trying to figure out with India and how ubiquitous a presence it has alongside China, the US, and other countries. Yep, that's it. So the question I am trying to look at is like, who do Nepalis and Malaysians see as the great powers in their lives, or great power? And what actors are making them think that? And this is where we get to the commercial landscapes with the commercial actors, because this is my term for capturing the idea of foreign commercial actors and being more present in people's lives than public ones, especially in this day and age when a lot of our own kind of experiences on a daily basis might be with individuals that work in a private capacity, as opposed to maybe, say, working for the government, or even just tangentially working as like a public actor, or working in a military capacity and those kind of aspects. And especially with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, like these kinds of things in themselves, I would argue are very much making people around the world becoming more, having more interface with private actors than, say, public one, especially of the commercial kind. But usually when we think about what is a commercial actor, we're usually thinking of for-profit, transactional, non-government entities, especially corporations, certain kinds of investment funds and equity and those kinds of different aspects related to investment and trade. But I like to take a broader view, especially because I think that a lot of these kinds of commercial actors in many ways can overlap in the kinds of goods and services they're providing. And sometimes it is not always for the sake of earning a profit or earning like the profitable resources and those kind of things. I think it might also be for trying to foster certain kinds of like educational initiatives, development, and those kind of things, which often involve the disbursement of grants, and then also could involve offering services like informing people via news network and having exchanges with foreign news agencies between, like, say, Nepal and India or Nepal, China, those kind of things. And then, of course, with all of these different kinds of nonprofit institutions that have been active, even in the one video about the Barbara Foundation and things like that, I think in that way, I'd like to argue that these in themselves, despite not being for-profit institutions, can very well be commercial actors, which has deep implications for what people here in Nepal think about in terms of who they see as being like a very influential power in their backyard. All right. And now the other important part is why Nepal and Malaysia? Why spend a year going to these two countries in particular, especially given the sheer economic variation between them by World Bank metrics? It's safe to say that Malaysia is much higher on the economic ladder as an emerging market economy than Nepal is. But that being said, I also think there are some interesting aspects to these two, especially because of these kinds of engagements with, well, I say China and India in quotes because we're talking about engagements that have gone back for centuries when a nation states weren't fully formed and there may have been several different polities that were engaging with what is now Malaysia and what is now Nepal. I don't think I have to say much about Nepal's own engagement just because of the sheer amount of interactions between northern India and then also with Tibet, and then when the British Empire was a major factor, a lot of these kinds of migrations that occurred via Darjeeling, via Kolkata, and these kinds of things that had brought Nepalis even into Malaysia, especially because it became harder to own land under the Ranas in the 1800s as like a common Nepali person. But for Malaysia, what's interesting is that even as far back as 900 years ago, there was a state within Malaysia, a city-state, if you want to call it that, called Kedah, that was actually very much connected to China forcibly by the Chola Empire that was prominent in Tamil Nadu at that time. And there was this pseudo-corporation called the 500, which was basically like a group of merchants that would run spice trade and all sorts of raw materials between Tamil Nadu and the Malay Peninsula, and then all the way up to southeastern China, especially under the Song dynasty. So in many ways, these are interactions that do not necessarily involve nation states, except arguably China, but that they go back for centuries, and that it shows that like these two countries also have very long-running interactions between what we now consider to be China and India. And of course there are other countries like that too in this region, but I also have an interesting take on this too. For anyone who has seen Sujeev Shakya's Nepal 2043, he also was talking about how the former Mahathir Mohamad Vision 2020, which was published in 1992, was also like a very heavy inspiration for his book. And I thought that was interesting how throughout the book he brings up Malaysia a lot. Because when I started with this idea of these two countries, I thought I was the only one thinking about this, but as I went through these 3 months, I keep finding more and more people that are drawing connections between Nepal and Malaysia for different reasons, of course. There's also a whole thing related to remittances, and there are many Nepali individuals that are sending funds home to Nepal as they work over in Kuala Lumpur or elsewhere, and it's also very much part of that global circuit of remittances that is a major part of Nepal's economy today. And then for those who know political scientist Paul Stanleyland, who had spoken here just a year ago in Kathmandu, he had released a report with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, talking about major powers, rivalry, and domestic politics in South Asia. And what he was talking about is mostly in relation to Nepal and Malaysia being in this state of a contestation with their foreign policy and domestic politics. And what that means is it exists when both governments and opposition mobilize a major power rivalry, but unevenly and fluidly in their international competition. So geopolitics in this outcome is an important object of domestic politics, but has not congealed into a deep divide with like a fixed policy. and with these kinds of aspects, especially with Malaysia and its 2018 elections, there used to be more of an emphasis on where do political parties stand with China, but at the same time, that has also ebbed and flowed in terms of how much that is an important topic in elections, especially with Malaysia, but in some respects in Nepal as well. And while there are certain political parties that might express a preference towards like one country or another, it is much more fluid than what Professor Staniland had encountered with some other countries that had much more rigid understandings about where political parties are with engagement towards China, United States, India, and so on. So I returned to these aspects just because I wanted to talk a little bit about the commercial actors that I have been able to speak with, and not to make this a very like vague kind of notion, but as like an umbrella term, there are many different people I have talked to over in who have worked in export-import in specific industries such as garments, in green energy, in specific organic products like spices and honey and those kind of things. I've even talked to people who are in the like EV market in terms of the different kinds of aspects related to I'm blanking out on one of them, but it's also something that is very interesting just because like a lot of the people who have been involved in trade, especially with like exports, imports abroad, one of the aspects that very much makes India a prominent part of their lives is just the fact of Kolkata's proximity as a port. Even if you're not trying to export or export an item to India directly, and you're trying to maybe send it to the United States or elsewhere, in many aspects you still have to send it to a port. And while China does have these kinds of dry ports as well as seaports, it's a vast difference of several hundreds of kilometers in terms of transportation, and just the cost effectiveness is really skewed towards keeping Kolkata, and that puts a lot of influence in terms of how people who are really trying to run that kind of trade see what kind of opportunities they can see in the northern border and the southern border, and they're very much going to think about India, at least in my mind, for the foreseeable future, so long as Kolkata remains the closest source, and air freight from Nepal directly remains very expensive for these kinds of exports. At the same time, I think what is interesting is just these different aspects with how India sees China's inroads into Nepal, because there have been many lamentations about the Belt and Road being maybe a nice idea in theory, but at the same time, a lot of these kinds of projects have been thwarted either by specific bureaucratic complications. It might also have been thwarted by specific kinds of restrictions that have been placed on it. I think the two most notable that have really come from India's reaction to this has been with the Pokhara airport and trying to restrict the airspace so that India will not send its any airlines over to that airport specifically, and then also not allow that kind of air traffic to come into India's airspace, largely because of a Chinese company helping to construct the airport. And the same comes with sharing with electricity and things like that, like trying to make hydroelectric transactions. It's very interesting just because for the the sole factor that China might have been involved in hydroelectric development, India has made it very clear that it would not purchase electricity if it's produced by this. But so it's like these kind of aspects in itself that are becoming a very tangible part in the calculus of Nepalis in very different walks of life, regardless of whether they are in the government here in Kathmandu or they are employed in specific joint venture companies. I think a lot of them, albeit with some exceptions, such as with cement and China's joint ventures and those kinds of industries, many of them see China as either something that is still very much a mystery or something that is still like a opportunity that is very off in the distance. It only is exacerbated further by the landslides that occur in the northern borders that have disrupted trade, that have also made it very hard to move shipments through the northern passes, such as Kirong and the other. It's not, no, Raswa is Kirong, right? There's that. Yes. Yeah, and then the Tatopani as well. Yeah, so those ones especially are pretty very much prone to these kinds of climate change induced disasters that can very much affect this kind of trade. And then in terms of the kind of foundations and nonprofit work that occurs, there are still a lot more people who are seeing India's universities as well as employment in India in different think tanks as a very viable option here in Nepal, especially either for primary education. Even my wife went to high school in Tamil Nadu, so she is very much in the same boat in this kind of calculus. Whereas while the amount of people who are going to Chinese universities is certainly increasing and has become a more apparent aspect, it is still something that I think has yet to match the level of institutional engagement that India and Nepal have seen, especially because it's a matter of from India's independence in '47 to today versus maybe at the beginning of the 21st century for China and Nepal and those institutional engagements. So when I think about the implications for all of this, I think it is, for one thing, Modi's efforts to clarify India's influence in South Asia as benign. It may indeed be a frustrated kind of exercise, because the realities on the ground is that Nepalis may be more likely to believe that, for example, Xi Jinping may not actually seek hegemony in this country particularly, just because of the everyday presence and much more frequent interaction and just presence of India and its commercial actors in this area. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. And at the same time, as far as this kind of posturing as an American, and I see the US's foreign policy towards China, it may be unproductive for a state like Nepal to try to devise a coherent foreign policy if its attention is being diverted from bigger priorities. So the US across the board definitely likes to sound the alarm about Chinese economic coercion, and for certain countries that might be justifiably so, but I argue that this could be detrimental for countries like Nepal when in many aspects India is the one that basically holds a lot more of the cards than China, but if the US is making Nepal bark up the wrong tree, it might have implications for devising a coherent strategy that Nepal can utilize across administrations, across political transitions, and all of these different aspects. So that is my talk. I went over a little bit, but I greatly welcome your feedback, as this is very much a ongoing project.
Yeah, so thank you, Daniel. It's been a very insightful session, and you beautifully explained the rise of the West post Second World War in line with the Bandung Conference, and also the role and influence of the commercial actress. Now I think it's safe to open the floor for questions. How do you want to do it? Like one person at a time, or would you like to take multiple questions and move ahead?
I think we're a small enough group, so one at a time. And please introduce yourself.
Okay, so please raise your hands and introduce yourself, and try to keep the questions very short, sir.
Thank you. I'm Major General Asa Bahadur Tamang, retired from the Nepali Army. Thank you very much, thank you Daniel for insightful talk on this commercial regarding our giant country, neighboring country. So my question is how Nepal can take benefit from these two countries like China and India, though it is not the Pacific area, but as you said that Nepal can take advantage of both countries. And in the link of this question, like you say, the Belt and Road Initiative connect the Nepal also, but sometimes it seems that Nepal to the airport is not functioning. So sometimes it seems that China and India both wants neighborhood first policy, but sometimes in commercial view they might have a kind of certain control on this access, including the port in Kolkata from the south side of our country. So how we visualize how Nepal can take benefit from both emerging economic power? I just like to thank you.
Yeah, and I admit that wasn't one thing that I really addressed in terms of the advantages that it might pose for Nepal itself. But this is something that, as I've been doing this field work, it's been very much in the back of my mind. And I am somebody who is very much supportive of the kind of people-to-people engagement that has existed between India and Nepal for decades. And especially with the kind of institutional exchanges with civil society groups and those kind of things, I think that Nepal can very much lean into those. But I also think in equal measure it can also get even more benefit by leaning into those same engagements with China. And I think that in itself is very much on the rise. I think there is much of a greater interest in trying to get people to either study abroad in China or also work in some kind of employment capacity for a partly owned or fully owned Chinese business and those kind of things. And I think trying to lean in with both of those in equal measure are very important, and I especially emphasize continuing the connections with India and Nepal, but to an extent that it is less coercive in terms of the kinds of things that have been seen related to oil embargoes in 2015 in regards to the Pokhara airport and the implications that it has for tourism and possibly air freight in the future if some of these obstacles are addressed. And then also in terms of hydropower, which is such a huge aspect with investment, it's something that I think it is something that India has to really ease off in terms of the kinds of engagement that Nepal does with China, just because of the capacity that Nepal has to engage with both countries in equal measure, and the fact that I think China, in many ways, as it continues to develop its own presence within the Tibet Autonomous Region, it has to acknowledge that there are different aspects that are important to focus on, and that's something that India has to be very sensitive about. I don't know if that's going to be with Modi in a sudden change of heart, but I'm hopeful for the next administration that that will be more of an emphasis, especially with a lot of the blunders in the past 10 years with Nepal-China relations that need to be crucially addressed.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, sir. My name is Kunjarai. I'm from US Embassy. First of all, thank you very much for your insightful presentation, and also during your introduction, I noticed that you've done some research work on BRI. So, given Nepal's BRI history and analyzing BRI effort, China's BRI effort in Nepal, how likely will BRI projects move forward in Nepal?
So, if we think about the BRI projects as essentially any kind of project that is backed by a commercial actor based in China, then in that lens, I see it as being a very likely presence that will very much increase over the next couple of years. Although in recent years there have been a lot of controversy about designating specific projects like the Pokhara Airport as a Belt and Road. If we are to, at least in a de facto sense, acknowledge that these are projects that are brought by commercial actors, then that in many ways can still be increased. At the same time, I think that China, with its own bilateral relations with India, has to acknowledge that not everyone can see its position vis-a-vis the BRI framework, vis-a-vis these other kinds of initiatives that it has for its understanding of one China policy and everything. I believe that the PRC, with a lot of these kinds of tensions, has to come around to the idea that the Nepal will have its own understanding, and this, as well as with the commercial actors that are coming to Nepal on their own accord, independent of the Chinese government, they will really try to increase that presence. But again, if we wanted to talk about this as the officially designated BRI projects, then this is something that I believe will be very much stratified for the near future, even when there are still going to be many of these commercial actor sponsored projects that are coming off the ground under the like Belt and Road radar and everything. I hope that answered your question, but
I was
feel free to
specifically
follow up.
asking the 10 designated BRI projects that was quoted.
Yes.
They recently signed the Dalton Road Corporation agreement last year.
Yeah, so there was controversy over whether the Pokhara Airport should be designated as a BRI project, and essentially in the Nepal government's perspective, China's government had overstepped and declared it a BRI project, which it was not completely on board with. And in these ways, if these kinds of like controversies over designating still continue, then it's very much going to be a difficult situation. But if we are willing to accept that a BRI project doesn't need an official designation to be a project that, for example, China or one of its commercial actors initiate, then it makes it definitely more likely that these kinds of projects will still come, regardless of India's own disagreements about these kinds of projects and other things.
So next question, yes.
Good afternoon. So thank you so much, Mr. Daniel, for giving this brief and explanatory briefing on this topic. So before I ask the question, I just want to introduce myself, retired Brigadier General Ramchandra Khatri. Luckily, whatever the names you have mentioned here in your PowerPoint projects, so I did my small course in Malaysia also. I served almost 5 years as a military officer attached there in India also. And fortunately, I have done one of the military army staff college there in Nanjing also. And in addition of that, fortunately, my son is studying somewhere near to your Northwestern University, that is in Wisconsin Medicine University.
Oh,
so
yeah.
this links, so I am somehow linked with this PowerPoint hangout. So my question is, at the last line, you have clearly mentioned, is this project worth pursuing more from a different angle? Of course, in your presentation, you have explained clearly about the economic pillar of these countries from your geo-economic point of view. That we are almost clear. Now, for this last part, if you can give us some ideas about the importance of the, they say, national interest of these three countries, meaning China, India, and Nepal, in relation to the geostrategic point of view, focusing to the and security, and geopolitical view, focusing to the political stability, especially in this Nepal. Because at the last sentence you have mentioned something about September 8 and 11, 8 and 9. That is related to our Gen Z movement, if I am not wrong. So in this regard, let's say geopolitics of Nepal, geostrategy of Nepal, by comparing these two countries, will it be possible to give some importance in your coming future projects? What about your views, please?
Yes, I think it is would still be crucial putting those two countries into perspective, and I bring up the Gen Z protest just because this was something that I discussed with my professors back in Northwestern about what this means for my fieldwork and what I am interested in researching. And I think one of the things that is very interesting is trying to see, okay, what is going to be the response to commercial actors from, say, India, from China, from other countries as well, but especially when it comes to the amount of investment that comes in, however small an amount that might be for Nepal. And the same goes for trade as well, because there have been articles by the Kathmandu Post that have talked about how the traffic at the northern border has not been as frequent as it was prior to the landslides in August. But it shows these kinds of things that are very much in the calculus of, if not the governments of India and China, then at least the commercial actors that are very much part of these logistical operations. And so when I think about these kinds of geopolitical considerations, I still have very much been going on as before with the project that I set it out to do in August. And I have been very much thinking to myself, if since September 8th that has been the right way to go. And especially because of a lot of these things related to, well, has this have all of these events been detrimental towards people that want to trade with Nepal, who want to invest in Nepal, or in other ways? And so far, this is something that is still materializing, and while that has occurred, I still try to go with, like, what is making China or India seem either more benign or less benign than, say, the reputation of the United States in the past several decades. My apologies, that was a very meandering response, but I hope that at least got to your question.
Thank you.
Next question.
I'm Janardhan, student of International Relations and Diplomacy at Tribal University. He is my teacher, Asisa. Very happy to meet you.
Yeah.
As I listened to you, I could grab some ideas that in the Indo-Pacific region, the countries of these regions like India, China are rising, and Indo-Pacific region has been the place for attention for other global powers also. So now, in this situation when in these regions new powers, new forces are emerging, and as we have understood, the strategic interest of the global powers also has increased. So in this context, when the power transition is evolving and the global attention is also is also a priority, so we can assume there can be certain geopolitical impacts and implications in these regions. In this context, the smaller countries, especially like Nepal, Sri Lanka, or even Bangladesh, what can be the impacts or implications for such smaller nations in this region, or even in the Southeast Asian nations?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last sentence? I was having a little bit of trouble hearing with the airplane flying overhead.
In the Indo-Pacific region, the new power landscapes are evolving, like India and China, and when this place is evolving in power and capacity, the global attention, the global powers attention is also increasing. In this context, we can assume that such type of new emergence of power shifts will create certain political implications. In that conditions, what will be the impacts and implications for smaller nations like Bangladesh, or like Nepal, or like Sri Lanka, or even let's assume of Maldives, or even in the ASEAN nations?
Well, I think the most immediate impact is we are definitely seeing kinds of like interconnectedness that are not as initiated by national governments as they used to be, and especially when even if for example, the recent Gen Z protests have maybe not been as affecting of the relationship with India or with China, but at the same time, it still shows that there are specific social organizations that are coordinating with one another across borders in cyberspace and those kind of things. And I think the implication for the smaller states is that there are just far more initiatives that are brought about by private actors, and that is still very much increasing with the utilization of social media and the growth of AI and those aspects. But I confess I'm not as much an expert on those areas. I know that Vivek, you've also spoken on this a little bit, if I read your LinkedIn page correctly.
Yeah.
So I think that is kind of interesting in terms of the ways interconnectedness is also helpful. But I think it is important to acknowledge the negative aspects, which is that there is definitely going to be more instances of political infighting, just because of the kind of ways in which different groups can sort of seep into the conversation without as much of a gatekeeping mechanism, and what I mean by that is the kinds of like political actors or people that used to be responsible for example, like peace negotiations after a political transition or other aspects. When there are different actors and many people can sort of enter into the conversation under the radar, this also lends itself to increased conspiracy theories. Now, whether that means that India and China are going to need to be on their toes as well as their commercial actors, I don't know for certain. But I think as they engage with smaller countries, this is something that they have to spend even more due diligence with, like focusing on what are the kinds of benefits that they hope to bring, and how do they actually show that they are somehow more benign than the West or Japan or other ones that had some kind of hegemonic baggage in the past.
So next question. Do we have any other question? If not, I think I'll add one question. So since we're talking about Nepal, China, and a bit of the US, so I think you understand the behavior of China, how it behaves in the international arena, and maybe to a some degree in Nepal. So I wanted to ask you related to the pullout of USAID. So the pullout of USAID has created some sort of an aid vacuum in Nepal. So looking at your study about China's behavior, looking at how they behave, well, what do you think? Would you think that they will step in to like fill up this aid vacuum, or will they like try to continue investing and sending their funds in whatever things they have been investing in previously?
I think that China is very much not at a point where it can replace the US aid in most respects, especially given the kind of controversies related to BRI designation and those kinds of things. At the same time, I think that the commercial actors that might be looking for some kind of opportunity to trade with Nepal from China or to invest in its economy, they are very much cautious about this situation with the Gen Z protests. I mean, if I had to think of one country whose commercial actors might be the most hesitant after this, I would definitely say China first and foremost, just because a lot of the commercial actors that have even considered investing here for most industries, they do not have as much experience. And of course there are exceptions to that. Like of course there will still be the Shibang Hongshu joint venture that has been going on for several years. There of course will be BYD as long as there is this like it has the dominating market share. And however, I think for the purposes of replacing US aid, you need to also look at these other like development outlets and look at commercial commercial engagement in these kinds of sectors. And I think at least for the foreseeable future, I think the Chinese commercial actors are most likely to take a step back and wait to see how the situation progresses. Whereas with investors from India, probably I would say are more accustomed to these kinds of situations, not just for Nepal, but like for other places within South Asia, as they consider trade and investment. At the same time, the linguistic and cultural similarities also helps in terms of trying to like reassure people that just, despite everything that happened September 9th and so on, that they can still return. I think India itself still has a lot of familiarity, but for China to replace U.S. aid, I think it's still far off. And at the same time, you even have other countries that I haven't mentioned that are trying to at least make some conscious effort towards these other sectors, especially with like South Korea. In August, they had contributed several millions of US dollars towards different industries with like tourism and agriculture and those kinds of aspects that I think with China and its commercial actors, it's definitely been a little bit too hesitant about this. And at the same time, you have a lot of other people who we keep hearing about over as this month progresses. It's like Germany, specific contributions from the Millennium Challenge Corporation itself, and these other things between like public governments providing aid, and then these private and / public sort of hybrid entities that are also trying to fill the gap, but it's still not at the point where it can still fill up U.S. aid. And I say that as somebody who would be very much agnostic towards China filling up that void, especially having studied abroad in Nanjing as a graduate student and everything. I think it's very important that at least there are ways to counteract these kinds of pulling out of development aid, and that just happens so abruptly and upend so many jobs here in this economy.
Okay, thank you. So do we have any more questions? If not, I think we've come to the end of our session. I would like to thank Daniel for joining us and accepting the invitation today, and thank you for everyone